My name is Diana, and I'm 45 years old. I've lived most of my life believing that a mother's love could conquer anything, poverty, loneliness, exhaustion, but that belief shattered one ordinary Tuesday morning. I was at work at the diner, wiping down a counter, when my vision blurred and the floor tilted under my feet. The next thing I knew, I was lying in a hospital bed with tubes running through my arm and a doctor explaining words that didn't sound real. "Severe heart blockage," he said. "You'll need surgery soon." For a few minutes, I just stared at him. My mind didn't process the words. All I could think about was the stack of unpaid bills on my kitchen table and the modest balance in my savings account. The doctor's lips kept moving, but I couldn't hear anything except the loud, slow pounding of my heart, the very organ that was betraying me. I've been a single mother since my son, Evan, was 6. His father left after deciding he was too young to handle the responsibility of a family. I remember that day as clearly as I remember the day Evan was born. Both days marked the start of a different kind of life. One filled with endless work, sleepless nights, and sacrifices I made without hesitation. I worked mornings at the diner and evenings cleaning offices, sometimes until my hands cracked from scrubbing, but I did it all with a smile because every penny I earned went toward giving Evan a better future. When he needed braces, I took extra shifts. When he wanted to join a basketball team, I borrowed from a friend. And when college came around, I emptied my small retirement savings just to keep him from taking student loans. He was my pride, the one person who made all the exhaustion worth it. And when he graduated, walked across that stage in his crisp black gown, I cried harder than I ever had in my life. He landed a good job in finance soon after and moved to another city. I told everyone at the diner how proud I was, how all those years of struggle had paid off. But now, lying in that hospital bed, all I could think was what happens if I can't afford this surgery. My health insurance barely covered the basics, and the doctor said I needed an additional $20,000 to proceed. That number might as well have been $1 million. Then, a thought hit me. Years ago, when Evan was starting out, I had lent him that exact amount, $20,000, to help with his first apartment, furniture, and a used car. He'd promised to pay me back as soon as he could. I'd never pressured him about it. I figured he'd repay me when he was stable. And from the looks of his social media, the trips, the dinners, the expensive suits, he was more than stable now. I picked up my phone, my hands trembling slightly, and dialed his number. My heart raced faster than it should have for someone in my condition. When he answered, his tone was brisk, distracted, the kind of tone people use when they don't really want to talk. "Hey, Mom," he said. "Everything okay?" I swallowed hard. "Not really, sweetheart. I'm in the hospital. They say I need heart surgery soon." There was a pause. A long one. "What? Are you serious? When did this happen?" "Just today," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The surgery is expensive, Evan. Insurance isn't covering everything. I need about $20,000 more to move forward." Another pause. I could hear muffled sounds in the background, laughter, clinking glasses. Then a woman's voice asked him something, and he mumbled back, "It's my mom." My chest tightened, not from my condition, but from something deeper. "Evan," I continued softly, "do you remember when I lent you that same amount years ago? You said you'd pay me back when you could. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't serious. He cut me off. "Mom, come on. That wasn't a loan. It was... You were helping me out back then. Tight right now, and I can't just hand over 20 grand like that." His words hit harder than the doctor's diagnosis. "Tight?" I repeated faintly. "Evan, it's not for luxury. It's surgery. I could die without it." He sighed, clearly irritated. "Mom, don't say that. Look, I'll see if there are charity programs or hospital payment plans you can try. I just can't do it right now, okay? I've got things going on." A hot wave of disbelief washed over me. Charity programs. Payment plans. This was my son, the boy whose scraped knees I'd kissed, whose birthdays I'd saved for, whose dreams I'd built my entire life around. "Evan," I whispered, "I need you. Please." There was a moment of silence. Then, with a coldness that froze me to the core, he said, "I'm sorry, Mom. I really can't help you right now." The line clicked dead. I sat there, phone still pressed to my ear, staring at the blank hospital wall until tears blurred everything. My heart monitor beeped rapidly, and a nurse rushed in, asking if I was okay. I nodded weakly, even though every part of me was breaking. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the pain in my chest spreading far beyond my body. I had given him everything, my time, my money, my love, and when I needed him, he gave me excuses. I tried to convince myself he was just stressed, that he'd come around. But deep down, something inside me shifted. The kind of shift you can't undo, the kind that turns heartbreak into resolve. And as I drifted into a restless sleep, one thought burned in my mind: if my son couldn't help me when I needed him most, then maybe it was time he learned a lesson no amount of money could ever buy. Mom, I can't just hand over 20 grand like that. Those words replayed in my head over and over as I lay in that stiff hospital bed, the antiseptic smell burning my nose, the beeping machines keeping rhythm with the pain in my chest. It was like my heart broke in slow motion, not from illness but from betrayal. I stared at my phone for hours that night, waiting for a call that never came. Every buzz made me jump, hoping it was him saying he'd changed his mind. But each time it was just another hospital notification or a message from a concerned coworker. Evan never called. He didn't even text to check if I was still alive. By morning, the numbness had worn off. And all that remained was anger, the kind of anger that seeps into your bones and makes you question everything you've done. I replayed every memory of him growing up: his first bike, his college acceptance letter, the night he cried when his first girlfriend broke his heart. Through every moment, I had been there. Now, when I needed him most, he was nowhere. Still, a mother's instinct is stubborn. I told myself he must have misunderstood. Maybe he thought I was exaggerating. Maybe that woman I heard in the background, his girlfriend, Vanessa, I remembered her name now, had distracted him. I convinced myself that once he realized how serious this was, he'd call back. So, the next afternoon, I dialed his number again. He answered after several rings, sounding mildly irritated. "Hey Mom, I'm about to head into a meeting, can we make this quick?" I tried to keep my voice calm. "Evan, I just wanted to follow up about the money. The doctor said I need to schedule the surgery this week. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't urgent." He sighed audibly. "Mom, I told you, I don't have that kind of money lying around right now." I felt my pulse quicken. "Evan, you make more in a month than I did in a year at the diner. You drive a car that costs more than this surgery. Please, I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for what I gave you when you needed it." He laughed, a cold, dismissive sound that didn't sound like my son. "You mean that, Mom? That was over 10 years ago. You said you wanted to help me get on my feet." "I didn't think it was a loan. I told you I'd need it back one day," I reminded him, my voice trembling. I said it over and over. "Look," he snapped. "I'm not trying to argue about this. Things are complicated with work, and Vanessa and I are saving for a down payment. I can't just throw away 20 grand because you didn't plan ahead for medical stuff." For a moment, I couldn't even breathe. The audacity in his voice, the entitlement. "Throw away?" I whispered. "That's what you call helping your mother stay alive?" There was silence on the other end, then a faint groan, like he was frustrated. "Mom, you're being dramatic. Hospitals have payment options. Maybe talk to a social worker. You'll figure it out." "Evan, I have to go." He interrupted. "I'll call you later, okay?" But he didn't. He hung up, and that was it. The tears came in waves, hot and uncontrollable. I pressed my pillow against my face to muffle the sound, embarrassed even though no one was there to see me. My chest ached, not from my failing heart but from disappointment so deep it felt physical. Later that evening, Nurse Clara, the night shift nurse, came in to check my vitals. She was a kind woman with soft eyes who noticed the puffiness around mine. "Rough day?" she asked gently. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. She didn't pry, but before leaving, she said something that stuck with me. Sometimes, when people let you down, it's not because they don't love you. It's because they never learned what love really means. Her words lingered long after she left. I didn't know if Evan loved me anymore. Maybe he loved the idea of me, the mother who always had the answers, who never asked for anything. But he didn't love me enough to inconvenience himself, and that truth cut deeper than any scalpel ever could. That night, as the ward lights dimmed and the rhythmic beep of machines echoed through the corridor, I stared at the ceiling and thought about every decision I'd made. I'd spent my whole life teaching Evan kindness, honesty, gratitude. But somewhere along the way, he'd learned entitlement instead. The next morning, I met with the billing department. I asked them about payment options, charity programs, anything that could help. The woman behind the desk smiled politely, handed me a pamphlet, and said I'd have to apply and wait for approval, a process that could take months. Months I didn't have. I walked back to my room, clutching that useless pamphlet, and sank into the bed. I had never felt so small, so alone. And yet, somewhere inside, beneath the sadness and betrayal, a small flame began to flicker, a quiet, determined spark. I realized that waiting for Evan's help was pointless. He had made his choice. But I still had mine. Maybe I couldn't control my illness. Maybe I couldn't control the coldness of my son's heart. But I could control how I responded. I could decide whether I'd remain a victim of his indifference or whether I'd teach him a lesson he'd never forget. I closed my eyes and took a deep, steady breath. For the first time in days, I felt clarity. I wouldn't beg, I wouldn't chase. I'd rise not in anger but in purpose. Because if my son refused to repay me in money, then I'd make sure he repaid me in understanding, a kind of debt that no currency on earth could ever settle. Lying in that hospital bed, I started remembering everything I had done for Evan over the years. The fluorescent lights above me buzzed softly, and every sound, the distant squeak of nurses' shoes, the quiet hum of machines, seemed to pull me deeper into memory. My body was weak, but my mind wandered relentlessly through time, tracing every sacrifice that led me here. I remembered the night his father left. Evan was asleep, clutching his stuffed bear, his little chest rising and falling in the faint glow of a plower sensor. Nightlight. His father packed a single bag and said he needed space. I had begged him to stay, not for me, but for Evan. But he didn't look back. When the door closed behind him, something inside me hardened, a silent vow that my son would never feel abandoned, not by me. From that night on, I became both mother and father. I worked before dawn and came home after midnight, my hands cracked from dish soap and cleaning chemicals. Some days I was so tired that I'd fall asleep sitting up, my apron still tied around my waist. But every morning, I woke up and did it again, because Evan deserved a future untouched by my struggles. When he turned 10, he wanted a new pair of basketball shoes, the kind all his friends had. I didn't have the money, but I worked an extra weekend shift cleaning the offices downtown. I remember slipping those shoes onto his feet, watching his face light up with pure joy. That smile was worth every ache in my body. Then there were the nights I went hungry so he could have a full dinner. I'd tell him I'd already eaten at work, but the truth was, I hadn't. I'd watch him eat from across the table, pretending not to notice my own stomach growling. Seeing him happy filled me up in a way food couldn't. As he got older, the sacrifices grew bigger. His senior year of high school, his class was taking a trip to Washington, D.C. I couldn't afford it, but I didn't want him to feel left out. So I sold my mother's old jewelry, the last pieces of family heirlooms I had. He never knew. He just came home with a smile and stories about monuments and museums, while I stared at the empty jewelry box, telling myself it was worth it. When college came around, I faced my biggest challenge yet. Tuition was astronomical. Evan got a partial scholarship, but there were still thousands left to pay. I remember sitting at the kitchen table late at night, papers spread out, running numbers over and over. Finally, I made the decision to cash out my small retirement savings. I told myself I could always work longer. My future didn't matter, his did. I'll never forget the day I helped him move into his dorm. The car was stuffed with boxes, and he was so excited he barely noticed the tears in my eyes. As I hugged him goodbye, he said. "I'll make you proud, Mom." Those words carried me through every sleepless night after. And for a while, he did make me proud. He graduated with honors, landed that finance job, and sent me pictures of his new apartment. I'd show them off to anyone who'd look, my coworkers, the waitress next to me at the diner, even regular customers. "That's my son," I'd say with a smile. "The first in our family to graduate college." But as I lay there now, surrounded by machines and medical charts, that pride twisted into something else: regret. I'd given him everything, and somewhere along the way, I'd taught him that love was something that demanded nothing in return. Maybe that was my mistake. I had raised him to believe the world would always be kind, that people would always give, but I had forgotten to teach him what it meant to give back. A nurse came in to check my pulse, and I smiled politely, hiding the turmoil brewing inside. After she left, I closed my eyes again and let the memories roll through like a film reel: every sacrifice, every late bill, every tear I'd wiped away before he could see. Each one felt like a thread being pulled from the fabric of my life, and I wondered how I'd let it all unravel so easily. I had always believed that motherhood meant endless giving, but now I realize that giving without boundaries doesn't build love, it builds expectation. And expectation, when left unchecked, turns to entitlement. I turned to the small window beside my bed, the city lights flickering in the distance. Somewhere out there, Evan was probably having dinner in a nice restaurant, laughing with Vanessa, completely unaware of the emptiness his silence had left behind. For the first time, I didn't cry. I just stared at those lights and let a strange calm settle over me. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or maybe it was acceptance. Either way, I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't keep living in the shadow of my sacrifices. I needed to take back the pieces of myself I'd given away so freely. And yet, deep down, the mother in me still wanted to save him, not from hardship, but from himself. Because I knew that if he didn't learn compassion now, life would teach it to him later in ways far crueler than I ever could. And that realization planted the seed of the lesson. I was about to teach him a lesson not born from anger, but from love that had finally learned its worth. The surgery was approaching, and I had no money and no options left. The doctors gave me 2 weeks, that's all. 2 weeks to come up with the remaining $20,000, or risk my condition worsening beyond repair. I nodded calmly when they told me. But inside, I was unraveling. How could a lifetime of hard work come down to a number I couldn't reach? At night, I stared at the ceiling tiles, counting them over and over to distract myself from the gnawing panic in my chest. I had never felt so powerless. For most of my life, I'd been the one to fix things: broken toys, scraped knees, overdue bills. But this was something I couldn't patch up with duct tape and determination. This was my life hanging by a thread, and the one person I thought I could rely on had cut that thread without hesitation. The nurses were kind. They'd check in, adjust my blanket, bring me tea. But kindness from strangers can only go so far when your own flesh and blood turns cold. I found myself replaying Evan's words over and over. "I can't just hand over 20 grand like that." Each time, it felt like another crack in my chest. One morning, as I sipped the bitter hospital coffee, my coworker, Lisa, called. She'd heard from one of the other waitresses that I was sick. Her voice trembled when she spoke. "Diana, I wish I could help more. I can send a few hundred, maybe." I stopped her gently. "No, Lisa, you've got your own family. Don't worry about me." But she hesitated. "You remember that piece of land your parents left you years ago, out by the old willow field? You still have it, right?" Her words made me pause. I hadn't thought about that land in years. My parents had left it to me after they passed a small patch of soil and memory. Too sentimental to sell, but too far to use. I hadn't been there in over a decade. That night, I couldn't sleep. Lisa's suggestion kept looping in my head. The land wasn't worth much, but maybe enough. I decided to dig out the old folder I kept in my hospital bag: property documents I'd saved for someday. Well, maybe someday had finally arrived. The next morning, I called a local real estate agent. My voice shook as I explained my situation, but he was kind and efficient. Within days, he found a buyer, a small construction company looking to expand. The offer wasn't huge, but it was enough to cover most of the surgery. Enough to save my life. When I signed the paperwork, I felt my throat tighten. That land held my childhood, the place where I'd chased fireflies, where my parents had planted apple trees, where my father once told me, "This land is your root, Diana. Don't ever lose it." And now, I was letting it go. As I handed the pen back to the notary, a tear slipped down my cheek. But then, a quiet voice inside whispered, "You're not losing it. You're surviving." With the sale finalized, I went back to the hospital and scheduled the surgery. The relief was mixed with sorrow. I had found a way to live, but at a cost that felt deeply personal. The nurses congratulated me, and I smiled politely, but inside, I was still raw. That evening, I sat by the window in my room, watching the sun dip below the city skyline. My body was weak, but my mind was starting to grow stronger in a different way. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for Evan to fix things. I was fixing them myself. I thought about him a lot during those quiet hours. I wondered if he'd even heard from the hospital, if he cared at all that his mother was about to go under the knife. But there were no calls, no messages, no flowers, nothing. And that nothing said everything. Still, I refused to let bitterness define me. I decided that once I recovered, I wouldn't chase him or scold him. Instead, I would do something far more powerful. I would live my life differently. I would teach him through silence, through example, through the one thing he never expected from me: detachment. The surgery was scheduled for Friday morning. The night before, I sat alone in the dim hospital room and whispered a prayer, not for my life, but for strength. I asked for the courage to accept whatever came next. When dawn broke, Nurse Clara, the one who always smiled kindly at me, came in to prep me for surgery. She held my hand and said, "You've got this, Diana. You're stronger than you think." I believed her. Because in that moment, I realized strength doesn't always look like power or control. Sometimes, it's choosing to keep your dignity when the world expects you to fall apart. As they wheeled me toward the operating room, I thought about my son, the boy I'd raised, the man he'd become. I didn't hate him, but I did pity him, because no amount of money could buy the kind of love he had thrown away. And as I drifted under the bright surgical lights, I made a silent promise to myself when I walked out of that hospital. I would no longer be the woman who begged for her son's kindness. I would be the woman who made him realize what he had lost. While arranging my surgery, I met someone who would unknowingly become part of my plan. Nurse Clara. She wasn't like the others. There was a calmness in her presence that felt almost maternal, a kind of warmth that reminded me of the person I used to be before disappointment hardened me. Clara was in her early 50s, with soft brown eyes and a smile that made even the cold hospital air feel bearable. The morning of my surgery, she held my hand as they prepped me. "You'll be just fine, Diana," she said with quiet confidence. "You've got a strong heart, it just needs a little help." I wanted to tell her that strength had nothing to do with muscles or arteries, that mine had been broken in ways surgery couldn't fix, but I only nodded. The operation was long. When I finally woke up, groggy and disoriented, Clara was the first face I saw. "Welcome back," she whispered. "You did it." Recovery wasn't easy. My chest felt like it had been split in two, which, in a way, it had. I was weak, tethered to machines, relying on others for even the simplest things. It was humbling and frustrating. But every time I felt myself slipping into despair, Clara was there, checking my vitals or just sitting beside me in silence. One afternoon after the doctors left, she pulled a chair close to my bed. "You've been through a lot," she said gently. "I can see it in your eyes. You're carrying more than pain, you're carrying someone else's guilt." Her words hit me so precisely that I froze. I hadn't told her much, just that I'd needed the surgery, that my family wasn't around. Yet somehow, she knew. I told her everything. How Evan refused to help. How I had sold my parents' land to save myself. How I had spent my entire life giving, only to be left empty-handed when I needed love the most. I didn't cry this time. My tears had dried up days ago. I just spoke slowly, methodically as though recounting someone else's story. Clara listened without interruption, her face calm but her eyes glistening. When I finished, she said something that would stay with me forever. You can't teach people compassion by giving them comfort, Diana. Sometimes, they only learn when they're forced to face what they've taken for granted. I let her words sink in. She wasn't suggesting revenge, she was suggesting truth. A truth Evan had never had to face. He'd grown up believing I'd always be there to clean up his messes, to say yes, to make things right. Maybe it was time he learned what absence felt like. After a few weeks, I was moved from the hospital to a small rehabilitation center to regain my strength. Clara arranged it herself, visiting me often, even though it wasn't part of her job anymore. She'd bring me tea and talk about her life, her grown daughter who lived abroad, her garden, her love of old movies. It was comforting to have someone care without wanting anything in return. One afternoon, as we sat by the window, she said, "When you're better, promise me something. Don't carry this anger forever. Use it for something good. Turn it into strength." I smiled faintly. "I don't think I'm angry anymore. I think I'm aware." She nodded, seeming to understand. Awareness is the first step toward freedom. That night, I lay awake thinking about what she said. I didn't want to live the rest of my life bitter and resentful. I wanted peace, real peace. But peace wouldn't come from forgiving Evan right away. It would come from showing him what life looks like when you lose the one person who'd always believed in you. When I was finally discharged, Clara hugged me goodbye. "You've got a second chance, Diana," she said softly. "Don't waste it trying to fix someone who doesn't want to be fixed. Use it to rebuild yourself." Her words echoed in my head as I stepped out into the crisp morning air. The world felt new, fragile but alive. My body was healing, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. I took a cab home, and as we passed familiar streets, I thought about Evan again. Part of me still wanted to call him, to tell him I'd made it through, to see if he cared. But another part of me, the part Clara had strengthened, knew better. If I called, I'd be falling back into the same cycle, me reaching out, him retreating. No, not this time. This time, I would let him feel what it's like when silence replaces unconditional love. Over the next few weeks, I focused on recovery. I ate better, walked every morning, and even joined a small support group Clara had suggested. I met women with stories like mine, mothers abandoned, wives forgotten, daughters betrayed. Listening to them, I realized I wasn't alone. The pain that once felt unbearable now felt shared, softened by understanding. And yet, deep inside, something was still burning, a quiet, purposeful fire. I knew I couldn't just move on and pretend none of this happened. There was a lesson Evan needed to learn, and I was the only one who could teach it. As I looked out my living room window one evening, the city lights reflecting in the glass, I made a promise to myself. I would no longer chase my son's love. Instead, I would make him come face to face with what true loss feels like, not through cruelty, but through consequence. Once I was strong enough, I started putting my quiet plan into motion. Recovery had given me time. Time to think. Time to feel. And most importantly, time to plan. I wasn't plotting revenge in the way people imagine. No shouting. No confrontations. No scenes. My plan was built on silence, on reflection, on the kind of consequence that seeps in slowly until it can't be ignored. When I got home from rehab, the house felt different. It was cleaner than I remembered, almost sterile. My plants had wilted, the kitchen smelled faintly of disinfectant, and the stack of mail on my counter was nearly toppling over. It was a quiet reminder of how easily life moves on when you're not there to tend to it. I sat at the table, staring at the unopened envelopes, and felt a wave of calm determination wash over me. This wasn't the end of my story, it was the beginning of a new one. The first thing I did was simple. I went to the bank and checked my accounts. Even after the surgery and the sale of my parents' land, I still had a modest amount left, a few thousand in savings and some in the joint account I'd once shared with Evan. It was mostly symbolic now. He had access to it because, years ago, I thought it would help him manage bills or emergencies if I ever got sick. How ironic that when the emergency finally came, he hadn't even remembered. I closed the joint account that day. The teller, a polite young woman, hesitated when she saw his name on the file. "Would you like to keep it open and remove the secondary holder?" she asked. "No," I said softly. "Close it completely. I'm starting fresh." The words felt powerful, cleansing. Next, I made an appointment with a lawyer. My health scare had reminded me of one painful truth: nothing in life is guaranteed. I wanted to make sure whatever little I had left wouldn't go to waste. Sitting in that office, surrounded by shelves of legal books, I felt strangely detached as I signed the new will. I left Evan out of it completely. Instead, I designated my small remaining assets to the hospital foundation that had helped me pay for the surgery. I also included a small portion for Nurse Clara, as a thank you for her compassion. The lawyer raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure about this? You're leaving nothing to your son?" I smiled faintly. He already received his inheritance. He just didn't recognize it when he had it. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a pen and paper, writing a letter to Evan. Not a plea. Not an apology. Just the truth. I wrote about every sacrifice, every choice, every moment he probably didn't remember, but that defined my life. I reminded him of the time I sold my mother's jewelry so he could take that school trip, the years I worked double shifts so he wouldn't know what hunger felt like. I told him how proud I was when he graduated, how happy I'd been to see him succeed. And then I told him how it felt when he refused to help me, when he looked at my need not as an obligation born of love, but as an inconvenience. I didn't write with anger, I wrote with clarity. Because I wanted him to see me not as the mother who would always forgive, but as the woman he'd chosen to neglect. At the end of the letter, I wrote one line that I knew would linger with him long after he read it. "Evan, I don't need your money anymore. What I needed was your heart, and you couldn't give that." I sealed the letter in an envelope, addressed it to his apartment, and sent it via registered mail. I wanted to be sure he received it. A few days passed before the notification arrived he'd signed for it. I pictured him standing in his office or apartment, opening it carelessly at first, expecting maybe a request or a guilt trip. But as he read, I knew each word would sink in slowly, painfully, because it wasn't anger that burns deepest, it's disappointment. I didn't hear from him immediately, and that was fine. I wasn't looking for an apology, I was giving him space to confront himself. I wanted silence to become the echo of his own choices. Meanwhile, I continued rebuilding my life. I volunteered part-time at the hospital's charity program, the same one that helped me. I folded linens, served meals, and listened to the stories of others struggling with illness and abandonment. It gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. Sometimes, I'd glance at the door, half expecting Evan to walk in and surprise me. He didn't. But I wasn't waiting anymore. One afternoon, as I was sorting donations, Clara came by. She smiled when she saw me. "You're glowing," she said. "Looks like you're finding your peace." "Not peace," I said quietly. "Just balance." She nodded knowingly. Balance is peace's closest friend. That night, I went home feeling lighter than I had in months. I made myself a cup of tea, sat by the window, and watched the rain trace patterns down the glass. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't thinking about what I'd lost. I was thinking about what I was finally reclaiming. And when the phone rang 2 days later, displaying Evan's name on the screen, I knew the silence had finally begun to speak louder than words ever could. Evan called me 2 days after receiving the letter, furious. His voice burst through the phone like fire, hot and impatient, as if I had personally insulted him by daring to speak the truth. "What is this supposed to mean, Mom?" he snapped. "You cut me out of your will? You gave everything to some hospital and a random nurse? Are you trying to punish me?" I held the phone to my ear and took a slow, steady breath. I'd spent too many years reacting, explaining, defending myself. This time, I was calm. "Evan," I said evenly, "it's not punishment, it's simply reality. You made your choices, and now I've made mine," he scoffed. "Reality? Are you serious right now? You're acting like I'm some kind of villain. You know how busy I am. You know I have responsibilities. You think it's easy balancing everything?" I closed my eyes. I could picture him pacing probably in that sleek apartment I'd helped him afford, his tie loosened, his face red from anger rather than guilt. "Evan," I said softly, "when I was your age, I worked 2 jobs and raised a child on my own. I didn't have time or money, but I made both. Don't talk to me about responsibilities." He went silent for a moment, then muttered, "You're being dramatic." That word again. Dramatic. It was his favorite defense whenever he didn't want to face the truth. I felt the familiar sting in my chest, but I swallowed it down. "I'm not being dramatic, Evan. I'm being honest. And honesty feels uncomfortable when it's been missing for too long." There was a long pause, the kind that sits heavy between two people who suddenly realize they're not speaking the same language. Finally, he said, "You're really doing this? You're really cutting me off completely?" "Yes," I replied. "Completely." Then, before hanging up, he muttered, "Fine, do whatever you want." For days, I heard nothing more. I thought maybe that was it, that he'd retreat into his pride and pretend I didn't exist. But pride, as I knew well, has a way of eating at you from the inside. It starts as anger, then slowly turns to doubt, then to guilt. A week later, I received an unexpected message, not from Evan, but from Vanessa, his girlfriend. It popped up one evening while I was reading. I stared at the screen, surprised. "Mrs. Clark," it began. "I hope you don't mind me reaching out. I just wanted to say I'm so sorry for what happened between you and Evan. You don't deserve any of it. I've been trying to make him see how wrong he was, but he won't listen. I've decided to leave. I can't be with someone who treats his own mother that way." I read her message twice, slowly. It wasn't vindication, I felt it was sadness. Sadness that it took a stranger to see the truth my own son refused to acknowledge. I typed a short reply, "Thank you, Vanessa. I wish you peace and happiness." That night, I sat on my porch and looked up at the stars, wondering what Evan was doing. Was he angry? Embarrassed? Did he even care that Vanessa had left him? I didn't know. But I hoped that, for once, the silence around him was starting to echo. A few days later, my neighbor, Judith, stopped by. She'd known me for years, a sweet woman who loved gossip almost as much as she loved her roses. "I ran into someone at the grocery store," she said, lowering her voice. "They said your Evan's been having trouble at work, missed some deadlines, something about a big client pulling out." I nodded quietly, saying nothing. My heart twisted, not out of satisfaction, but out of something deeper. I didn't want his downfall. I just wanted him to see the truth. That night, I got another call. This time, when I saw his name on the screen, I hesitated before answering. "Mom," he said, his voice quieter now. "Can we talk?" "Of course," I replied. There was a pause, a shaky breath. I shouldn't have yelled. I was upset. Everything's been going wrong lately, and... He stopped himself, as if realizing how hollow that sounded. "Anyway, I just wanted to check if you're okay." The words were cautious, tentative, like a man testing the temperature of water before stepping in. "I'm fine," I said gently. "Better than before, actually. I've been volunteering at the hospital." "Oh," he muttered. "That's good." Another pause. "I saw what you wrote in that letter. I don't agree with all of it, but I get that you're hurt." "I'm not hurt anymore, Evan," I said softly. "I was. But now I'm learning peace. Sometimes losing something or someone helps you find it." He didn't answer right away. Then I heard something I hadn't expected, the faint sound of him sniffing, trying to hold back tears. "Mom," he whispered. "I messed up. Didn't I?" I wanted to say yes. I wanted to tell him exactly how deeply he had broken me. But instead, I chose grace. "We all make mistakes," I said. "What matters is what we do after them." He didn't respond, but I could feel the heaviness between us shifting slightly, but enough to notice. Then he said quietly, "I'll call you soon." "Take your time," I replied. When the call ended, I sat in silence for a long while. The anger, the bitterness, they were gone. What replaced them was something calmer, heavier, more meaningful. I wasn't out to destroy my son. I was teaching him something far more lasting than punishment: empathy. And as I looked out at the dark sky, I realized the cracks in Evan's perfect life were finally beginning to show, not because I wanted him to suffer, but because sometimes pain is the only mirror that reveals who we truly are. News travels fast in our small hometown, especially about money and morals. Word of Evan's troubles started trickling back to me in fragments: whispers from neighbors, co-workers, even customers at the diner who still remembered me from my years behind the counter. It started with a rumor about a failed client presentation, then about missed deadlines, and finally about a heated argument with his boss that ended with him storming out of the office. At first, I didn't believe it. I didn't want to. No mother wants to picture her child's life unraveling, even when that same child once left her to face her darkest hour alone. But soon, the pieces fit too neatly to deny. His girlfriend gone, his career faltering, the foundation he'd built on pride and self-interest was cracking, just as surely as my faith in him once had. One evening, I got a call from Lisa, my old coworker. "Diana," she said softly, "I saw Evan last week. He looked lost, thinner, tired. He didn't even notice me at first. When I said hello, he forced a smile, but his eyes, they looked broken." I thanked her, hung up, and sat for a long time at my kitchen table, staring at my cup of tea until it went cold. I wanted to feel satisfaction, some sense of poetic justice. But all I felt was a deep ache, the ache of a mother who knows her child is finally tasting the consequences she'd prayed he'd never have to face. A few nights later, my phone rang again. This time, it was him. His name lit up the screen, and for a moment, I considered not answering. But love, no matter how bruised, still has a way of reaching for the sound of your child's voice. I picked up. "Mom?" His voice was barely a whisper. "I'm here," I said quietly. There was a pause, the sound of muffled breathing, like he was fighting to steady himself. I lost my job," he said finally. "They said I wasn't performing, but it's not true. I was just distracted, okay? Everything's been falling apart since." He stopped himself before finishing the sentence. "Since what?" I asked gently. "Since you sent that letter," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I keep thinking about what you said, about the sacrifices, about the things you gave up for me. I didn't realize how much you'd done. I guess I didn't want to realize." I leaned back in my chair, my heart tightening. "Sometimes realizing too late is the only way we learn, Evan." He sighed. I know, Mom, I don't know how to fix it." I wanted to tell him it wasn't about fixing, it was about understanding. But I stayed silent, letting him sit in the discomfort that had once been mine. Silence can be a teacher, too. Over the following weeks, he called occasionally. The conversations were short, sometimes awkward, but there was a vulnerability in his tone that hadn't been there before. He started asking questions about my recovery, about how I was spending my time, about the charity foundation at the hospital. He never asked for money or help. For once, he was the one seeking connection instead of control. Then came the night that changed everything. It was late, well past midnight, when the phone rang again. His voice was hoarse. "Mom," he whispered. "I'm sorry for calling so late, I needed someone to talk to." "What's wrong, Evan?" I asked, my heart tightening with concern. He hesitated, then confessed. "I've been drinking a lot lately. I didn't mean to. But it helps me stop thinking. I don't know who I am anymore. I thought I had everything figured out, the job, the relationship, the future. But it all feels empty now." I swallowed hard, my throat tightening. "You're realizing that success without compassion isn't success at all," I said softly. He didn't respond right away. When he finally did, his voice was shaking. "I wish I could go back, Mom. I wish I could fix what I said to you. Every time I close my eyes, I hear my own words that I couldn't just give you the money. It makes me sick." For the first time in months, I felt tears rise again. But not from pain, from something closer to hope. "Evan," I said quietly, It's not about the money anymore. It never was. It was about the heart behind it. I wanted to know I mattered not just as your mother, but as a person. He broke down then, sobbing quietly into the phone. I let him. I didn't interrupt. Sometimes silence is the only comfort that doesn't feel like pity. When he finally caught his breath, he said, "Mom, I don't deserve your forgiveness." "Maybe not," I replied softly. "But that's what makes forgiveness so powerful." After that night, our calls became more frequent. He didn't talk about his job or finances anymore. He talked about memories, the summers at the lake, his favorite birthday cake, the time we got caught in the rain walking home from the bus stop. It was as if he was trying to rebuild something fragile, one small memory at a time. But through it all, I didn't let myself forget what Clara had told me. People don't learn compassion through comfort. I listened, I guided, but I didn't rush to make things easy for him. He needed to feel every bruise left by his own choices. Weeks passed. I started noticing the change in his tone, less arrogance, more humility. The man who once thought he was invincible was learning what it meant to be human again. And though I still felt pain when I thought about what he'd done, that pain had transformed into something lighter understanding. And as I hung up the phone one night after hearing him whisper, "I love you, Mom," for the first time in years, I knew the cracks in his life weren't breaking him anymore. They were reshaping him. Sometimes life has to shatter us before we can see what we're truly made of. A few weeks later, Evan showed up at my door thinner, pale, and hollow-eyed. It was a Sunday afternoon, and I was sitting in the living room folding laundry when I heard the hesitant knock. For a moment, I thought it was a delivery, but something in my chest stirred a quiet knowing. When I opened the door, there he was, standing on the porch with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, his eyes red and tired. "Hey, Mom," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. For a long moment, I just looked at him. My heart recognized him instantly, even if the man before me seemed like a stranger. His once expensive clothes were wrinkled, his hair unkempt, and there was a heaviness about him that hadn't been there before the weight of humility. "Evan," I said finally, "come in." He stepped inside, glancing around as if unsure he still belonged. The house hadn't changed much, the same photographs on the walls, the same scent of lavender and lemon from my cleaning products. But to him, it must have felt like walking into a memory he had long abandoned. He sat on the edge of the couch, hands clasped together, avoiding my eyes. I didn't know where else to go," he said, voice trembling. "I lost my apartment. I've been staying with a coworker, but he's moving out of state." I nodded slowly, studying him. "You could have called," I said, though there was no accusation in my tone. "I know," he whispered. "I didn't think you'd want to see me." I sighed. "You're my son, Evan. I'll always want to see you. But wanting to see you and wanting to save you are two different things." He looked up at me then, eyes glistening. "I'm not asking you to save me. I need to understand how I got here, how I became this person." For a long time, I didn't speak. I simply watched him, my son, the boy I once carried in my arms, now broken by the weight of his own choices. Finally, I said, "You stopped listening, Evan. Not just to me, but to your own conscience. You mistook comfort for success. You thought love was something you could use, not something you had to nurture." He swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "You're right," he said. "And I hate it. I hate who I became." I stood up and walked to the kitchen, pouring 2 cups of tea. When I handed him one, he took it with shaking hands. "You know," I said quietly, "there was a time I thought forgiveness meant forgetting. That if I just moved on, the pain would fade. But it doesn't. It lingers until you face it." "I want to face it," he said quickly, his voice cracking. "I want to make things right." I met his eyes. "Then start by listening, not to justify, not to explain, but to understand." He nodded. And for the next hour, we talked. Or rather, I talked. And he listened. I told him about the nights I'd gone hungry so he could eat. The holidays I'd spent alone while he was busy building his career, and the day I sold the last piece of my parents' legacy to afford my surgery. I spoke calmly, without bitterness, just truth. Each word seemed to sink into him like stones dropped into deep water. When I finished, he didn't say anything. His head was bowed, his hands gripping the edge of the cup so tightly I feared it might shatter. Then, in a voice barely audible, he said, "Mom, I'm sorry." It wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't the kind of apology meant to erase the past. It was quiet, raw, and real. Tears welled in my eyes, but I blinked them away. "I forgave you a long time ago, Evan," I said softly. "Not because you asked me to, but because I needed peace." Forgiveness isn't about letting someone off the hook. It's about freeing yourself from their weight. He looked up, confusion flickering in his eyes. "You forgave me even after everything I did?" "Yes," I said. "But forgiveness doesn't mean things go back to the way they were. It means we start again differently." He nodded slowly, taking in every word. For the first time, I saw not the boy I raised or the man he tried to become, but a human being stripped of ego, vulnerable, teachable, real. That evening, he insisted on cooking dinner. It was simple pasta and garlic bread, but it felt like a feast. As we sat at the table, eating in quiet companionship, I could feel the distance between us shrinking. Not erased, but softened. After dinner, as he washed the dishes, he turned to me and said, "Mom, I don't deserve your kindness. I can't believe after everything, you're still here." I smiled faintly. "That's what mothers do, Evan. We don't disappear. But we don't forget, either." He nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I want to do better," he said quietly. "I want to be the kind of man you can be proud of again." "You don't have to make me proud," I replied gently. "Just be honest with yourself, with others. That's all I ever wanted." He smiled weakly, and for the first time in years, it reached his eyes. That night, after he went to sleep on the couch, I stood in the doorway watching him. His breathing was slow and steady, his face peaceful in the dim light. And in that moment, I felt something shift inside me, not just forgiveness, but understanding. Because sometimes, love isn't about rescuing someone from their fall. It's about standing quietly beside them while they learn how to rise again. The real transformation began when Evan started visiting regularly. After that night on my couch, he didn't disappear again. He began showing up every few days, unannounced but always with purpose, bringing groceries, helping fix small things around the house, or simply sitting quietly on the porch with me as we watched the sunset. He didn't talk much at first, but his presence spoke volumes. He'd changed. The arrogance, the hurried tone, the defensiveness that used to drip from his every word, they were gone. In their place was humility, a quietness that felt genuine. I'd spent years wondering if the world would ever humble him. Now, I was seeing that it finally had. One Saturday morning, I found him in the backyard sweeping leaves. "You don't have to do that," I said, smiling from the doorway. He looked up, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "I know," he said, "but I want to." It was such a simple statement, yet it carried everything I'd been hoping to hear. He wasn't doing it out of guilt or obligation, he was doing it because he finally understood what giving meant. Over the following weeks, he began driving me to my follow-up appointments. He'd wait patiently in the lobby, scrolling through his phone or talking quietly with the nurses. One day, Clara, my steadfast friend, spotted him waiting and later told me, "He looks at you differently now, Diana. Like he's finally seeing you, not just expecting you." That comment stayed with me. Seeing and expecting, they were worlds apart. At home, Evan would often sit in the kitchen while I cooked. He'd ask questions about my recipes, laugh at my stories, and sometimes just listen in silence. Every now and then, I'd catch him looking at me with a softness I hadn't seen in years. It wasn't pity, it was gratitude. One afternoon, as we were washing dishes together, he broke the silence. "You know," he said quietly, "I've been volunteering at the hospital charity, the one you mentioned before." I froze, mid-rinse. "You have?" He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Yeah. I met Clara actually. She told me how much you've done for them. She also said she's never met anyone who gives without expecting anything back. I guess she doesn't know I used to be the exact opposite. I chuckled softly. People change, Evan. He nodded thoughtfully. Yeah, I'm starting to believe that. The more time he spent helping others, the more I noticed his spirit healing. He began talking about things beyond money, purpose, compassion, second chances. He even told me about a patient he'd met, a single father struggling to pay medical bills. I helped him fill out his paperwork, Evan said, his voice tender. He reminded me of you, Mom. He kept saying he didn't want his kid to worry about him. I told him not to lose hope. That story made my eyes sting with tears. The son who once refused to help his own mother was now helping strangers not out of obligation, but out of empathy. Weeks turned into months. Evan found a modest job at a smaller firm, not nearly as glamorous as his old one, but he said he liked it better. Less ego, more people who care, he said with a grin. He started coming over every Sunday. We'd cook dinner together, nothing fancy. Just simple meals that tasted like comfort. It felt like the home I'd been missing for years had finally returned, not through wealth or success, but through humility and love. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast golden light through the kitchen window, Evan put down his fork and looked at me with sincerity that nearly undid me. Mom, he said softly, you didn't just give me life. You gave me a chance to be human again. I didn't realize how lost I was until you stopped trying to save me. I reached across the table and took his hand. Sometimes, the hardest thing a parent can do is step back and let their child fall. But if the fall teaches them how to rise, it's worth every tear. He squeezed my hand, his eyes glistening. You're right. And I'm finally ready to rise, Mom, for real this time. That night, after he left, I stood at the kitchen sink, staring out into the dark. The stars shimmered faintly through the trees, and I whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude. Not just for my health or survival, but for this moment of peace I never thought I'd see. The next morning, as I poured myself a cup of tea, I found a small envelope on the counter. My name was written on it in his handwriting. Inside was a note. Thank you for never giving up on me even when I didn't deserve it. Tucked behind it was a folded brochure from the hospital charity, marked with a sticky note. I want to do something special you'll see soon. And as I read those words, I felt my heart swell with something I hadn't felt in a long time, not just pride, but hope. A mother's quiet, healing hope that maybe the lesson had finally taken root where love alone could not. Evan handed me an envelope with trembling hands. It was a quiet Sunday morning, one of those days when the air felt still and the house smelled of freshly brewed coffee. He had come over earlier than usual, and there was a nervous energy about him, the kind I hadn't seen since he was a little boy about to show me a report card he was proud of. Mom, he said, his voice shaky but warm, there's something I need to give you. I raised an eyebrow, curious. Evan, you didn't have to bring me anything. Just seeing you is enough. He shook his head, smiling faintly. This isn't a gift, Mom. It's something I owe, and something I want to give. He slid the envelope across the table. I hesitated before picking it up. My fingers brushed against the paper, and I could feel the weight of it, not the physical kind, but the emotional one. Slowly, I unfolded it and looked inside. It was a check. My eyes widened as I read. The amount $20,000, the exact sum I had once begged him for. I looked up, my mouth slightly open, unable to find words. Evan, what is this? He swallowed hard, his eyes already glistening. It's what I owed you. The money you lent me all those years ago. I didn't pay you back when I should have. And when you needed me most, I failed you. This isn't just about the money, Mom. It's about closure. It's about finally doing what I should have done from the beginning. I sat back in my chair, staring at the check, my heart heavy with emotion. Evan, I don't need this, I said softly. You don't have to repay me. He shook his head again. I know, but I need to repay you. Not for your sake, for mine. I could see how much it meant to him. How much this moment was healing something deep inside him that words never could. I didn't want to just hand it to you and walk away, he continued. I wanted to do something meaningful with it. I've been talking with Clara and the people at the hospital charity. I want to start something in your name. My breath caught. In my name? He nodded, smiling now, though tears shimmered in his eyes. Yeah, a fund for single mothers who need help paying for medical care. People who are going through what you went through, scared, alone, with no one to turn to. We're calling it the Second Chance Fund. My hands trembled. I pressed them to my chest, feeling my heartbeat quicken. Evan, that's beautiful. He reached across the table and took my hand. You've always given people second chances, Mom, me most of all. I think it's time we pass that on. Tears spilled down my cheeks before I could stop them. For so long, I had dreamed of hearing something like this, not for the sake of redemption, but for recognition. Not of the sacrifices I'd made, but of the values I'd tried to instill. The following week, Evan and I went to the hospital together to meet with the charity board. Clara greeted us at the entrance, her smile warm and knowing. So this is the son I've heard so much about, she said, teasing gently. Evan smiled sheepishly. I owe you a thank you too, Nurse Clara. You were there for my mom when I wasn't. Clara patted his arm. The best way to thank me is to keep being there for her now. During the meeting, Evan outlined the plan the fund would provide emergency financial assistance to single parents in need of life-saving medical treatment. He wanted it to be sustainable, so he committed to contributing a portion of his income each year, along with volunteer hours. As I listened, I couldn't stop watching him. His posture was different, upright but humble, confident but gentle. He spoke not like the self-assured man who once flaunted success, but like someone who had finally found meaning beyond it. When the meeting ended, Clara turned to me, her eyes bright. Diana, you must be proud. I smiled through tears. More than proud. I'm grateful. That evening, as we left the hospital, Evan and I walked through the garden outside the same one I used to sit in during my recovery, where I had once stared at the sky and prayed for strength. Do you remember when you said you didn't need my money anymore? Evan asked quietly. I nodded. Yes, I said I needed your heart. He smiled, his voice thick with emotion. Well, this time, you're getting both. I laughed through my tears, squeezing his hand. The air was cool, the sky streaked with fading light, and for the first time in years, my heart felt whole. A few weeks later, the hospital held a small ceremony to announce the launch of the Second Chance Fund. They asked Evan to speak, and I sat in the front row, my hands clasped together, my heart swelling with pride. He stood on stage, his voice steady but full of feeling. This fund isn't just about money, he said. It's about compassion. Something I learned the hard way from the most selfless woman I know. My mother taught me that true love doesn't come from comfort, it comes from sacrifice. And this is my way of honoring that. The crowd applauded, and I felt tears streaming freely down my face. For years I had carried the pain of his rejection, but in that moment, all I could feel was grace. When the ceremony ended, Evan came down and wrapped his arms around me. You didn't just give me life, Mom, he whispered. You gave me a conscience. That's worth more than anything. I held him close, breathing in the familiar scent of my son, and for the first time, I felt peace settle deep in my soul. Because in that moment, I realized the lesson had come full circle not just for him, but for me. Love, when tested, doesn't break. It transforms. With Evan's transformation, our relationship began to heal in ways I never expected. It wasn't sudden or cinematic, it was gradual, steady. Like watching winter melt into spring. The distance that once sat between us slowly dissolved, replaced by something softer and far more genuine. He started coming by more often, not out of guilt, but out of love. We'd spend quiet afternoons cooking, watching old movies, or tending the garden together. He even planted a small apple tree in the backyard. For Grandma and Grandpa, he said, smiling. So we never forget where we came from. It was such a simple gesture, yet it carried a depth that words couldn't capture. One Sunday morning, we were having breakfast when he said, Mom, I've been thinking a lot about forgiveness lately. I looked up from my coffee. What about it? He leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. I used to think forgiveness was something you got once you said sorry. But now I realize it's not about words. It's about change. It's about living differently. I smiled. Exactly. Forgiveness isn't a transaction, it's a transformation. He nodded slowly. I guess I'm still learning that. I think we both are, I said softly. The weeks that followed were filled with small, beautiful moments. Evan helped me paint the living room, repaired an old shelf his father had built years ago, and even took me out to dinner, something we hadn't done since he was a teenager. Over meals and long drives, we began talking about things we'd both avoided for years: his father leaving, my struggles raising him alone, his fears of failure, my quiet regrets. Each conversation felt like opening a window in a house that had been sealed for too long. The air between us grew lighter. At the hospital, the Second Chance Fund was growing. Stories of single parents who received help started coming in: a mother of two who got her surgery just in time, a father recovering from an accident who could finally afford rehab, a young woman who said the fund restored her faith in people. Evan made it his mission to meet many of them personally. Each time he told me about one of their stories, his eyes shone with pride, not in himself, but in the good the fund was doing. One afternoon, he showed up with a stack of thank you letters from some of the recipients. "These are for you," he said, handing them to me. I opened one. It was from a woman named Nadia. She wrote, "Your fund saved my life. I didn't think anyone cared until I received that call from the hospital. Thank you for believing in people like me." As I read her words, tears filled my eyes. I looked up at Evan, who was watching me quietly. "You did this," I said softly. He shook his head. "No, Mom, we did this. You showed me what compassion looks like. I just followed your example." I couldn't speak for a moment. My chest swelled with emotion, but it wasn't the painful kind I'd once known. It was warmth, healing warmth. In the months that followed, our bond only deepened. Evan began speaking at charity events, sharing our story not to gain sympathy or admiration, but to inspire others to reconnect, to forgive, to rebuild. One night, he came over after one of those talks. He looked exhausted but fulfilled. "You should have seen them, Mom," he said. People were crying, not because of sadness, but because they understood. Everyone's got a story, everyone's lost something. But it's what you do after the loss that defines you. I smiled proudly. "You're finally living the lesson, Evan." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I think I am. And I owe that to you." As the seasons changed, so did I. My health improved, my energy returned, and the lightness I thought I'd never feel again found its way back into my days. I began volunteering full-time at the hospital, helping organize the charity events Evan often spoke at. We worked side by side sometimes, him on stage, me in the crowd, both of us finally walking the same path. Our home became a place of laughter again. Holidays that were once marked by silence now overflowed with warmth and joy. Evan would bring new friends, people from the charity, co-workers, volunteers, and together we'd fill the house with stories and food and light. I often caught myself watching him from across the room, still amazed by the man he had become. He wasn't perfect, none of us are, but he was kind, thoughtful, present. And that meant more to me than any success or apology ever could. One evening, as we sat by the window watching the sun dip below the horizon, he said, "Mom, I've been meaning to tell you something. I've been saving up again, not for me this time. I want to expand the fund, make it national. There are too many people out there who need help." I laughed softly. "You never stop, do you?" He smiled. "Not when it feels this right." I reached over and took his hand. "You've come so far, Evan. I'm proud of you. Truly." He squeezed my hand gently. "I just want to make sure I never forget what matters again." And as we sat there, the sky painted in shades of gold and lavender, I realized something profound. Pain, when transformed, becomes purpose. The heartbreak I once thought would destroy me had become the foundation of something good, something lasting. Evan was no longer the son who broke my heart, he was the man who helped mend it. And together, we had learned that love, once lost, can return even stronger when forgiveness takes its place. Looking back now, I realize forgiveness was the hardest, yet most freeing choice I ever made. It didn't happen in an instant, it was a process. A quiet surrender that unfolded over time. For months after everything that happened, I'd still wake in the middle of the night, haunted by the memory of Evan's voice saying, "I can't just hand over 20 grand like that." But now, when I thought about it, I didn't feel pain. I felt peace. Because that sentence, as cruel as it once sounded, became the spark that changed everything for both of us. I used to think forgiveness was something you gave to the other person, that it was about setting them free from guilt or blame. But I've learned that true forgiveness is something you give yourself, a release from the poison of resentment. Without it, you stay trapped in the very cage someone else built. When I look at Evan now, I don't see the son who betrayed me. I see the man he's become: humble, thoughtful, empathetic. And in many ways, he has taught me as much as I taught him. Our story is a strange one, filled with heartbreak and healing, but it's real. It's proof that people can change if they're given the space to see their reflection clearly enough. The Second Chance Fund has grown beyond anything we imagined. It started with one act of remorse and one mother's pain, but it turned into something much bigger, something that keeps rippling outward. Each month, the hospital sends me updates: new, families helped, surgeries funded, lives saved. Each story feels like another thread stitching my heart back together. One letter, in particular, stood out to me recently. It was from a young mother named Delia, who'd received emergency treatment through the fund. She wrote, "Someone once said that love given freely always finds its way back. I don't know who helped me, but please tell them they gave me more than a second chance. They gave my son his mother back." When I read those words aloud to Evan, he wiped his eyes. "That's exactly what you did for me," he whispered. Sometimes we'd sit in the hospital garden, the same one where I used to walk during recovery, and just watch people pass by. Parents holding children's hands, patients talking with loved ones, nurses laughing on their breaks. It all reminded me how fragile and beautiful life is. Every breath, every chance to love, every mistake forgiven, it's all a gift. One afternoon, Evan and I were sitting on a bench beneath the blooming magnolias when he asked, "Mom, do you ever wish things had gone differently? You know, that I hadn't failed you?" I thought about it for a long moment before answering. "No," I said finally. "Because if things had gone differently, you might never have learned compassion, and I might never have learned peace." He smiled faintly, looking down at his hands. "You're better at forgiving than I am." I shook my head gently. "No, Evan. I just learned that forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened, it's about accepting that it happened, and choosing not to let it define you." He nodded slowly, as if committing that lesson to memory. Later that week, we attended another charity event together. Evan gave a short speech, heartfelt, sincere, and afterward, several people came up to thank him. One woman said, "Your story gave me courage to call my father again after 5 years. I didn't think I could forgive him, but I realized holding on to anger was only hurting me." I stood nearby, watching as my son, once so self-absorbed, so distant, hugged that woman and told her he understood. The moment filled me with quiet awe. Life had a strange, beautiful way of coming full circle. That night, as we drove home, the road stretched out under a sky full of stars. The hum of the tires was the only sound between us for a while, until Evan spoke softly. "Mom, I don't think I ever told you what that letter did to me, the one you sent after the surgery." I looked at him, curious. "It broke me," he said, voice trembling. "But in a good way. I'd built this version of myself around pride and success, and your words tore it down. At first I was angry, but then I realized you were right. I was blind. And I think maybe I needed that heartbreak to finally see." Tears filled my eyes, but I kept my voice steady. "Sometimes, Evan, love means letting someone break. It's the only way they can rebuild stronger." He reached over and took my hand as he drove. We didn't say anything more for the rest of the trip. We didn't need to. The silence between us was no longer heavy, it was full, sacred. Back home, after he dropped me off, I sat on the porch for a while, listening to the night. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain. I thought about everything that had happened, the fear, the pain, the betrayal, the growth, and I realized something profound. All along, I'd been so afraid of losing him, but maybe that loss had been necessary, because sometimes, when something breaks, it doesn't end, it just changes shape. It becomes something new, something wiser, something deeper. And as I looked up at the stars glittering in the darkness, I whispered to myself, forgiveness isn't about what we let go of, it's about what we choose to hold on to. And I chose love, even after everything. Especially after everything. If I could go back, in time, I wouldn't change a thing, not even the heartbreak. It sounds strange to say, but pain has a way of sculpting you into someone stronger, someone more aware. What once felt like the cruelest wound of my life became the very thing that taught me the meaning of grace. The lesson my son learned wasn't born from anger or revenge, it was born from love, the kind that teaches rather than destroys. Now, when I look at Evan, I see not just my son, but a man who carries compassion in his every gesture. He still visits every weekend, sometimes bringing groceries, sometimes bringing nothing but stories from his week. He laughs easily now, a laugh that feels lighter, freer. There's no tension in his shoulders anymore, no defensiveness in his tone, just sincerity. The Second Chance Fund continues to grow, expanding far beyond what either of us imagined. Evan now works closely with hospitals in other states, helping establish similar programs. He calls me after every milestone, his voice brimming with pride, always saying the same thing, "Mom, we did it." Sometimes I'll visit the hospital to see the new mothers who've received help. I sit quietly in the corner, watching them hold their babies, their faces filled with hope instead of fear. Every time I do, I think about the woman I used to be, the one lying in that hospital bed, terrified and alone, waiting for a call from her son that never came. And then I think about the woman I am now, whole, peaceful, grateful. The contrast humbles me. One afternoon, I was invited to speak at a small community event organized by the charity. They wanted me to share my story, not the financial side, but the emotional journey behind it. I hesitated at first. I wasn't used to standing before a crowd. But Evan encouraged me. "Mom," he said, "your voice started all of this. People need to hear it." So, I agreed. The room was small, filled with people who looked just like me, tired, hopeful, resilient. I took a deep breath and began. "I once believed that love was about giving everything," I said. "That a mother's heart should have no limits. But I learned that unconditional love doesn't mean unconditional sacrifice. It means teaching others to value love, to honor it, not exploit it. When my son refused to help me during my illness, I thought my heart would never recover. But what I didn't realize was that it wasn't breaking, it was stretching, making room for understanding. As I spoke, I saw people nodding, some even wiping tears from their eyes. Sometimes, I continued, the people we love the most need to lose us for a while in order to find themselves. My son had to face his own emptiness before he could fill it with compassion. And I had to face mine before I could fill it with peace. When the event ended, a woman approached me, her voice trembling. "Your story gave me hope," she said. "I've been estranged from my daughter for 3 years. Maybe it's not too late to heal." I squeezed her hand. "It's never too late," I told her. "But healing doesn't always start with an apology sometimes. It starts with silence." That night, Evan drove me home. We didn't speak much, but when we pulled into the driveway, he turned to me, his expression soft. "You're amazing, Mom," he said quietly. "You didn't just survive, you turned your pain into something beautiful." I smiled. "So did you, Evan." He looked down, shaking his head with a humble grin. "You know," he said after a pause, "I used to think success was about money, status, things I could measure. But now I know success is about impact, the lives you touch, the people you lift. You taught me that." Tears stung my eyes as I reached over and touched his hand. "No, sweetheart, life taught you that. I just refused to protect you from the lesson." We both laughed softly, the kind of laugh that comes from peace, rather than joy. As the months went by, I noticed a change in myself too. I was lighter, not just physically, but emotionally. I started taking walks again, tending to the small garden out back, spending evenings reading by the window. Sometimes, I'd catch the faint reflection of that apple tree Evan planted for my parents, its branches swaying in the wind, and I'd feel this deep, grounding sense of contentment. Evan began speaking at national conferences, sharing our story not as a tale of guilt and redemption, but as one of transformation. He'd always end his talks with the same words. My mother didn't teach me a lesson through anger, she taught me through consequence. And that lesson saved my life. Each time I heard that line, whether live or in recordings, my heart would swell with pride. Not because of what he said, but because of what it meant. He finally understood. I often think about that moment years ago when I was lying in a hospital bed, desperate and alone. If someone had told me then that the same pain would one day lead to healing not just for me, but for so many others, I wouldn't have believed them. But life has a strange way of turning sorrow into purpose when you stop fighting it. Now, as I sit on my porch in the evenings, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I feel at peace. The past no longer haunts me, it humbles me. The future no longer scares me, it inspires me. Because the greatest gift I ever gave my son wasn't money. It wasn't even forgiveness. It was wisdom, the kind born from heartbreak, nurtured through silence, and shared through love. A lesson money could never buy, but one that will live on in every life our story continues to touch.